So, and I guess, you know, in hindsight, that is all pretty clear to me, but, you know, when you're going through it and you've committed and all those sorts of things. So suddenly I've sort of, you know, raised this issue of advertising and the sequence of events from here on in is a little bit, you know, I don't want to sort of say on this date, but this is where it all goes pear-shaped. I mean, and when I say pear-shaped, I mean, you know, when you drive through Berry and there's that giant orange? Well, this is like a pear about that big. So, it's, you know, so I guess in no particular order, things that started to happen were, I started to question whether he was the right agent for us. I might have been a bit late with that, but keep in mind there's two people, it's me and my ex, so it's not, if it was just my decision, it would have been done and dusted.
And you're a pretty casual kind of guy too.
Look, I'm casual unless someone gets me a bit worked up, and there's no question this guy got me worked up, okay? Because I don't like being, I try to be really generous with how I word things, but I don't like being hoodwinked, let's call it that, right? Whether you want to call that misled or lied to or however you want to phrase that. At the end of the day, things started coming out that instead of them being just bad service, were just out and out misleading. So for instance, when I started to question whether or not we might want to get out of the contract, there was a let out clause in our contract. In other words, if I wanted to buy the house myself and buy my partner out, we could stop within that 90 days and the only cost we would be up for would be marketing costs. And that was made clear in the original contract.
Ah, so if you withdraw it, you pay?
But pay the marketing costs only, but no other costs. So, you know, if we'd got a sign, for instance, or a brochure, which was a hard cost to him, of course, you know, we wouldn't get the brochure for free, sort of thing. So,
right, that's a very, very significant point.
Right, sorry about that.
Because the 10 grand isn't actually for a sale only. It's if it sells, we'll include the advertising in that.
Correct.
But if it doesn't sell, you pay all the costs.
But the advertising was at a fixed, it was at a maximum of $1,950.
Right, okay.
So I still in my head went, okay, worst case scenario is no matter how many press ads, no matter whether he's doing skywriting or whatever, it's $1,950, so that's the most I'm up for. So during this 90-day period, probably towards the back end of that, I say to him, hey look, if I wanted to bail out now, how much is the marketing going to cost me? What have we run our bill up to? Keeping in mind no press ads or anything. And weirdly, and quite coincidentally, we'd run up exactly $1,950 worth of costs according to his maths, which I was a little bit surprised about, that it came to that exact amount.
60 days.
So it took me about 2 or 3 times in writing to request him to break that down, because I thought rather than just taking his word for it that it was about $1,950, I should get him to quantify that. And of course, when he sent the breakdown through, it didn't really match what he'd quoted up front. So he'd quoted, you know, brochure was this much, sign was this much, da-da-da-da, and then his breakdown was, you know, $100 for emails, you know, that was never quoted, that, you know, I mean, to this day I don't, you know where I stand on that, but certainly no cost for emailing was ever mentioned. The brochure and the photography and all those costs were higher than he'd originally quoted. So at this point I've gone, well, hang on a minute, that's not bad service. I think that's just, something here just doesn't add up, literally. And so that was one of the first kind of upsets. And that's, you know, now I'm starting to get a bit annoyed because I go, hang on a minute, I felt like I was being taken advantage of, right? It wasn't, it was, you know, $1,300 worth of marketing you've used. It was, oh, you've used all of it, so you're going to pay the maximum now.
Okay.
And that's still not the worst bit, right? So then we get to the good one, right? So we get a, I can't even tell this story without getting worked up. So we get an offer, okay? And the offer is much closer to where we're getting to. So it's $460, the offer, right? But it's subject to sale. Okay, so for me, that's not a great offer. Okay, knowing what the market's like, knowing, you know, how much of a challenge everyone's having selling their house, we get this subject to sale offer. The numbers, you know, almost acceptable, but at the low end, but the conditions are, you know, pretty cruddy. Let's you know, call a spade a spade. But he definitely thought that was an amazing offer and one that we should absolutely take. And you know, I've got all these emails saying, you know, we absolutely encourage you to take this. We think it's great.
That now they're personal emails now?
Yeah.
So they're not the group emails?
No, they're not the group emails.
Gone away from the groups?
Yeah,
right,
so,
okay.
because now he's trying to encourage me to sign a specific contract.
And this is after you're wanting to terminate the agreement?
Yeah, sort of about the same sort of time. Because
triggered by that, do you think?
Well, look, I wouldn't say that.
Okay,
I wouldn't say that, yeah. So, and this is where it gets a bit tricky, and perhaps now is a great chance for me to ask the question that I asked you by email. And of course, I've never sold a house subject to sale before, so I wasn't completely sure of what the rules were. But my understanding is what was required of us was to sign a contract with these people. During that contract period, we would take our house off the market effectively. They would have that amount of time to sell their house. And then at the end of that time, they either had sold their house and they would go through and buy ours, or they hadn't, and I wasn't sure what happened there. And so my concern was, and you know, keep in mind, I'm trying to sort of deal with my ex and you know, all this sort of stuff, so it was a little bit delicate, but my concern was, well, what if we take our house off the market for this period of time, and then they don't end up buying it? We are paying the mortgage this time, and of course we get left out of pocket. So we asked the question in that context, and we said, is there any way we can get them to pay some sort of deposit so that if this doesn't go through, we've at least got money to pay our mortgage? And in our heads, we thought, you know, look, about $5,000 would cover the mortgage for this period of time, so can we do that? And his response was a one-line email that said, pretty close to quote unquote, when they sign the contract, they pay a $10,000 deposit. Does that answer your question?
Oh. Right.
Which was a pretty open answer.
Yeah.
And I, of course, jumped at that because although up until now I probably seem like a complete and utter moron for going into this contract in the first place, at this point I'm a bit more savvy and I've gone, actually, no, it doesn't answer my question because it didn't answer the meaning of what I was trying to understand. And so I asked a series of specific questions which were, you know, who does the deposit go to? Is it a refundable deposit? You know, do we get to keep any or all of it if the sale doesn't go through? And I was much more specific. And again, I got a written email back, which, you know, again, I won't be able to quote unquote this, but it sort of said two things. One, it said, we get to keep the deposit if, and I'll quote this bit, they fall off the face of the planet, was one way we would get to keep the deposit. And the only way they would get it back is if both parties agreed to void the contract. And I still wasn't really comfortable with this. I emailed again and said, look, I don't really care if they fall off the face of the planet. I consider that an unlikely event. Right? What I really want to know is there any situation under which we have no control and no say in it, under which they get their deposit back? And it was at this point that I didn't feel like I was getting straight answers, and I rang Tim Threadgold, and I said, Tim, I know I didn't get you to sell my house, but I'm in the poop now. Can you answer this question? I said, this is a situation, it's a subject to sale. Is there any way they get that deposit back? And he basically said to me, yeah, if they don't sell the house, they get their deposit back. Is that
It's pretty straightforward.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's taken me 3 or 4 emails with my real estate agent who I'm paying $10,000 to represent my interest, and I still haven't got a straight answer. And like I say, this is an email, TOOP. You know, this isn't my hearsay. This is an email that I've gotten written here which says, if both parties agree, and unless I'm mistaken, even now talking to you, it's got nothing to do with whether I agree with it or not. Well,
it depends how they word it, but the standard real estate contracts are that subject to sale of property is exactly that. They don't sell the property, they get the deposit back, you part company, no money changes hands. That's the standard, has been for 35 years. Right. There's nothing's changed. So, it's a pretty straightforward discussion.
So you can gather now that at this point, I'm on to the fact that I'm not getting great quality information from this guy, okay? And now I'm getting, you know, you said before I was a pretty casual guy, now I'm not casual. Right. Okay, now I'm mad, right? I'm not just even peeved, I'm actually mad, because I go, this, to the best of my understanding, is just a flat out misleading piece of information. So anyway, he's still forcing us to sign this contract. When I say forcing, you know, he's, you know, trying, you know, everything to say, oh, look, you know, you should sign this, should sign this, should sign this. And that works on my ex, okay? And God bless her, you know, she's nervous about, are we going to sell this thing or not? So she goes, it's the only offer we've got on the table for this amount, let's sign it. So she signs it. He rings me and he says, look, you know, your partner's, ex-partner's signed the contract, so I'm ringing to organise for you to sign it. And I say, look, I'm not going to sign it. He goes, what do you mean you're not going to sign it? I said, well, it's a subject to sale. I don't want to take my property off and sign this contract, because once I take it off, I'm stuffed. I mean, that's how I perceived it. And at some point during this conversation, I said to him, look, you need 2 signatures, because he's very persuasive, or however you want to call that. Again, I'm being generous. He said, I said to him, look, you need 2 signatures to make this sale happen, and you're not going to get mine. I have the ability to scuttle this sale. That was what I said to him. And I said, and that's what I'm going to do, because this is not acceptable to me. And he turned around on the phone and said to me, are you honestly telling me you'd do that to another human being? And I presumed he meant my ex, because I wouldn't describe him that way. And at that point, I probably went from mad to whatever's above mad, furious, probably even higher than that. And I was in my office at the time, and when I get a little bit mad, I get quite animated, but when I get really mad, I get really quiet. And I said to him, and there were a few swear words in there, I don't mind admitting this, I said, mate, you are my real estate agent. I do not expect you to speak to me like that. And I said, you know, you're at risk of me, A, hanging up on you, and B, coming down there and being rather unpleasant to you, which is the kind of thing that I would say, because I really wanted to give this guy a piece of my mind. I thought that, I don't mind people, you know, sort of using sales techniques to encourage you to, you know, buy something or sell something in this case. I mean, that's the way the world works, and it's what I do for a living in a roundabout way with advertising. But I thought him saying, you know, would you do this to another human being, was so far out of line it wasn't funny. Anyway, the phone call ended pretty badly. Needless to say, I didn't sign the contract. And that night I thought, am I really that out of tune with things? So on Facebook, I relayed the conversation and I said, here's what I said, here's what he said. I said, what do you guys think? Do you guys think I'm being out of line, or is it this guy? And that was like a Wednesday night or something like that. And so by Thursday morning, I had an email from him in writing, a very legal email.
So he'd seen that on Facebook?
It was set to private, so it was only available to my friends.
Right, okay.
But obviously one of my friends is one of his friends.
Oh, that's right.
And perhaps a better friend of his than they are of mine.
Right.
So within about sort of a 12-hour period, I had a legal email explaining that unless I deleted that email and promised never to speak about this stuff again, that he would be suing me for defamation.
Right.
So I told you this gets worse, right? You're thinking signing this contract is a bit of a sucker's deal, but...
Well, I hope those listening are starting to get into this story.
So we've sort of gone from bad service, and instead of him, and how I would conduct business and how I imagine most people would conduct business, if someone's unhappy with the service, you would address that in some way, shape or form. His way of addressing my unhappiness with his service was to threaten to sue me. Okay, and this was a very comprehensive, very legally, wasn't a, you know, casually, you know, oh look, would you mind? You know, this was all legal terms, okay, and it was basically you've got 7 days to delete that, right? And it was very, you know, very specific, and, you know, it was, you know, a legal email. So this is on the Thursday morning. On the Thursday afternoon, I sent him an email saying, look, would you mind, you're not a friend of mine on Facebook, so I don't know what you have and haven't seen. Would you mind explaining what you want me to take down and what about it was defamation? Because my understanding of defamation was it sort of has to be untrue. Right? If you're just saying what happened, I don't, you know, it's like me talking to you now, right? And of course, he never replied to that on the Thursday afternoon. And then on the Friday morning, I got an email that said, congratulations on the sale of your house. We've got an offer for $465,000, not subject to sale. I'll be there at 1 o'clock to sign the contract with you. Which I thought was a little bit surprising, that perhaps I'd sold my house without knowing about it as well. Call me old-fashioned, you know. I thought maybe that would be my decision, not his, and that maybe again there'd be a phone call. I accept maybe by this stage he's a bit nervous about calling me, you know.
Yeah.
But he did. I called my ex and I said, look, what's this about? She said, look, he called me. Did he not call you? So he comes in at 1 o'clock. And, you know, we go through this process. And of course, under normal circumstances, again, if it had been my decision only, I probably wouldn't have signed it. Because now I'm just suspicious, right? Where does this offer? No, a different offer from a different person, apparently.
Different person. Oh.
So exactly the same amount, but different person, not subject to sale. No details, again, you know, over the phone. I'm going, look, who was this person? Where did they suddenly appear from? I mean, in a period of 24 hours, he's gone from trying to get me to sign a subject to sale contract to telling me my house...
block the other offer.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Which, you know, to telling me I'd sold my house to someone else for the same amount without those conditions. While I'm being potentially sued by the person I'm paying to represent my best interests, which seems a bit, I don't know, again, maybe I'm narrow. I didn't think I was narrow-minded, but maybe I'm narrow-minded, but that seems a little bit odd to me.
So, look, I'm desperately trying not to comment on any of this because I think it's really, you know, the story that's important, not my take on it. So where to now? Just to wrap it up, just to perhaps put it all into a, you know, couple of minutes. Where do you think we're up to?
Well, look, I mean,
and then we'll go to lessons learned.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so in really short terms, I signed that contract, so officially the house went through cooling off, and now we're just waiting for settlement, which is, you know, about 10 days away. So presumably that's a done deal.
Congratulations.
And you know, and in fairness, the result was, even though it was at the bottom end of our expectation, I understand it's a tough market, right? So I go, you know, not delighted, but okay, done. I then made a bit of an attempt to make some peace with this guy. So I sent him an email explaining, now that all the dust had settled, what my challenges were with all the process, hoping that I would get some sort of meaningful feedback. And the meaningful feedback I got was reiterating that he would sue me for defamation if I still didn't remove it. Because of course I didn't remove it. I'm not very good with bullies, and that's how let's call it a spade a spade. That's how I see this guy. I see this guy as a bully. I don't see him as a real estate agent. I don't see him as anything. I see him as a person who uses, you know, we all hear horror stories, but let's face it, I mean, this is, I don't know, have you heard a better one than this? Oh, you probably have you've been in it for many years, but it's got to be up there.
Things go wrong, and there are different circumstances, but that's why it's important to hear the kind of the start and the finish, you know, because there's a number of, but anyway, so keep going. So
at this stage, I would have to say that there's still pending legal action against me. And of course, my reaction to that is, well, A, go your hardest, because I don't think I've done anything wrong. In fact, not only have I not done anything wrong, but I think I'm probably the person who has been wronged. And now, I suppose, without sounding too petty, I'm quite keen to make sure that people are aware of certain kinds of people who operate this way, because I would hate to think that someone else would end up in the situation that I've ended up in. It's enough that there's one sucker out there that fell for it, and that's me. And I could be embarrassed by that, and I am a little bit, but I'd much rather say to people, hey, you know, I've learned a few lessons from this. I learned them the hard way. Maybe you could learn them the easy way. I'm not trying to do your job for you, because I think you're going to do the lessons in a minute. But yeah, I mean, to say that the wheels fell off was just, you know, a massive understatement. The fact that I might even have to go to court for saying that I wasn't happy with my real estate agent service, and that's his idea of, I don't know, being my agent. That's pretty. What more can I say? So, you know, there's the deposit, there's the, you know, the tactics, there's the, you know, misleading information about marketing, and then when I say that I'm unhappy, I get threatened to be sued.
Well, lessons learned.
Tim is on speed dial now, let me tell you. Tim Fredgold, speed dial, got it.
All right. Lessons learned. What do you reckon?
For me?
See if you can get to 3 key lessons.
Oh, look, I wouldn't put all realist independents in his category, but I would be cautious of using a smaller independent agent. I mean, I feel like I would feel much safer going with someone who is bigger and has a good reputation. One thing I neglected to mention in there was I rang the Real Estate Institute. I don't know how awesome they are, but of course this guy's not part of the Real Estate Institute.
That's always a good sign.
Which means that they basically said, bad luck, there's nothing we can even, we can't even call the guy on your behalf. So I would probably, you know, that would seem like one of the most basic things, but you know, make sure they're in the Real Estate Institute. I don't know how I would have ended up if he had been, but at least I would have had another avenue. I don't know, that's 2 lessons. What's the third one? I don't use this guy in particular.
Sputnik, thanks mate. And hopefully that just gives you a snapshot of just Mr. Average. Would you call him Mr. Average?
I don't know that I would ever be called average, no, but it was certainly a fairly average experience.
Okay, and terrific having you on. Hopefully your next experience will be a good one.
We'll be with you, so of course it will be.
Okay, and thanks so much for sharing it, mate.
No problem,
much appreciated.
Mate. Cheers, thanks.
Okay.